Have you ever imagined that the invincible titans of the north, those who torched the thrones of Europe and spread terror across the corners of the earth with their blood-soaked axes, would one day bow to the dominion of Islamic civilization? Not by the power of the sword alone, but through the harmony of hearts? How could those giant wooden dragons, which breathed death and destruction into the Guadalquivir River and violated Seville, the bride of Al-Andalus, for 7 days and nights, transform into peaceful lambs melting into the fabric of a Umayyad society? What civilizational magic made the descendants of Ragnar Lothbrok and the fiercest of Viking warriors abandon their bloody paradise of Valhalla to embrace the religion of peace? Trading the clashing of weapons for the sound of their livestock, only to become the most famous cheese and dairy makers in the Andalusian markets. How did the majesty of the sea demons dissolve before the fury of Greek fire? And the political acumen of Abd al-Rahman II, turning an epic written in blood and ash into an eternal tale of coexistence? A tale proving to the world that the swords of Muslims were never drawn to harvest heads, except to build a lighthouse of mercy and lay the foundations of a caliphate that adversity only made more majestic, towering with absolute sovereignty over the seas. Welcome to our mysterious journey today. I am Dodi, and together we will uncover the hidden depths of history and the secrets of the past. Welcome to the Dodi drama world, where every story is a doorway to another realm. Join our growing family now. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to be the first to experience the magic of our tales. Imagine standing on the banks of a small river in Seville in the year 229 of the Hijra, a breathtaking Islamic city, fragrant with the scent of roses, oranges, and olives that fill the orchards. A profound stillness reigns, where you can barely hear anything but the gentle murmur of water in the fountains and water wheels, blending with a melodious voice proclaiming the truth from the highest minarets. You stand on the bank, gazing toward the fresh waters, but you see nothing. An eerie silence enveloped by thick fog that obscures the horizon. Suddenly, you catch a glimpse of giant wooden dragon heads emerging from the river. Sudden panic erupts across the city. A terrifying shriek pierces the silence from out of nowhere, shattering the calm with a single phrase that strikes terror into the hearts of peaceful residents. The armies of the Magus have arrived. The fleets of the Magus have arrived. The Vikings, the storm that unleashed from the far north, led by the sons of the iconic Ragnar. They shattered the fortresses of England, torched the churches of France, and became the unstoppable boogeyman of Europe. Monsters who swept through giants in their path as if they were on a mere excursion. Now, it was the turn of their next adversary. They arrived at the lair of the Muslims in Al-Andalus, fully confident that it would be another stroll, a kingdom to overrun just like the ones before. But would it truly be a stroll? Or would they meet an adversary fiercer than anyone they had ever faced, one who would teach them a lesson for the history books? Prepare yourselves, for we are not talking about an ordinary battle. We are about to witness a true epic from the age of hunting human whales, titanic warriors who consumed hearts, swords that reaped heads, and a blazing Greek fire that turned giant ships into sunken ash in the depths of the sea. Around the mid-9th century AD, Al-Andalus was a paradise on earth, the crown jewel of the entire world. It possessed power, knowledge, advancement, and a prestige that made every king in Europe dream of it, yet think 1,000 times before approaching its borders. Especially since it was under the rule of Muslims, who were a formidable force at the time. The seasoned emir of Al-Andalus was Abd al-Rahman II, the grandson of the Hawk of Quraysh, and they even called him the second Hawk of Quraysh. Therefore, Al-Andalus was a red line for all European rulers. But suddenly, the winds shifted, bringing with them the scent of death from a place not even on the map, from the darkness of the frozen north, from which only monsters emerge. Beginning a strange civilizational clash. A clash between a brilliant, sophisticated Islamic civilization that had reached its zenith, and savages who knew no mercy and understood neither the language of peace nor treaties. An epic written in blood was about to unfold between the Muslim army and a group of the fiercest warriors in history. These beasts, whom the Arabs called the mages, were not mere invaders or an occupying army like those the Muslims had faced before. They were a human hurricane arriving from icy lands in strange, terrifying ships. The dragon ships, known as the Drakars, were the black magic of medieval warfare, the absolute secret to their power and dominance. They used them as instruments of war and intimidation. With their shallow draft, these ships didn't need a vast ocean or deep sea. They could sneak into shallow rivers and small lakes. Suddenly, you would find the Vikings emerging from the heart of your city, right between your houses, even when you thought you were safe, far from the sea. To the Muslims, the Vikings were a bizarre entity. A people who knew neither prayer nor fasting, who were not people of the book, neither Christian nor Jewish. For this reason, the Muslims called them the mages, drawing a parallel to the Persians who also did not worship a heavenly god, as their worship was based on the sanctification of fire and brute force. Their hair was long, and their axes were massive, capable of crushing stone, enough to terrify the bravest European knight with a single glance. Their creed was blood. They believed that anyone who died with a sword in hand would enter the paradise of Valhalla to feast and drink with the gods. Perhaps this was the one striking similarity between them and the Muslims. Neither side feared death. The Muslims yearned for martyrdom, while the Vikings dreamed of Valhalla. You can only imagine how ferocious their battle would be. On the other hand, the Vikings were not just savages blindly swinging axes, nor was their sole advantage brute strength, massive size, or a love for death. They were also highly intelligent military tacticians. During an assault, for example, they utilized the shield wall tactic, overlapping their shields to create an iron barrier, like a metallic wall that no arrow could penetrate. On the shores, they transformed into military engineers. Within hours, they dug trenches and threw up earthen ramparts, turning their camp into an incredibly fortified stronghold in record time. To arrive in large numbers with maximum agility, they didn't bring horses on their ships. Instead, they captured local horses upon landing, transforming into highly mobile, light infantry that moved with lightning speed between villages. They monitored the tides, exploiting them for their attacks, and waited for moments of army preoccupation or religious holidays to strike with absolute intelligence and ruthlessness. In short, they came from the sea not as stupid, barbaric pirates, but as reckless yet calculated warriors. You could say they were an organized, living nightmare that left nothing to chance. What I am telling you might sound like an exaggeration or excessive glorification, but it is entirely real. The proof is that they managed to turn the entire coastline of Europe into a playground of looting and burning, becoming the ultimate boogeyman to whom trembling kings paid tribute just to avoid their wrath. That is, until the day came when the sea. Demons decided to point the heads of their dragons toward the shores of the Umayyad Caliphate in Al-Andalus, confident that Arabic swords would be as soft as Andalusian silk, and that it would be a decisive victory, just like their previous ones. Little did they know they were marching straight into a meat grinder, heading toward a fierce enemy that would shatter their prestige and dominance forever. The Vikings' first appearance on the Andalusian coast was a terrifying attack on the western city of Lisbon. Lisbon was an incredibly powerful and fortified city, one of the major military bases of the Umayyad state. The Muslims had focused their defensive lines and forces inland to prevent any landward attacks and toward the Mediterranean coast to prevent any maritime assaults, which was entirely logical. However, there was a third front they paid little attention to: the Sea of Darkness, the Atlantic Ocean today. A vast, endless ocean with towering waves and unfathomable depths, where no one dared to sail and no fleet dared to launch an attack. A terrifying sea, which is why it earned that name, so it was left without strong defenses. They never imagined that they would see giant wooden dragons slicing through this sea of darkness, or that titans would emerge from them to overrun the city's shores. They besieged Lisbon in a suffocating grip for 13 days, fighting fierce battles and winning them all. They violated the city, plundered its riches, and wreaked havoc, making their first appearance a genuine horror that shook the coasts of Al-Andalus. This was the spark that alerted Al-Andalus and its emir, Abd al-Rahman II, to the appearance of a brutal new enemy on the stage, one vastly different from anyone they had ever faced before. After Lisbon, they did not stop. They continued their campaign southward with their massive fleet of 80 dragon-headed ships, storming the city of Cadiz, one of the most important cities and the maritime gateway to Al-Andalus. The Vikings committed atrocities there as well, turning it into a mass of fire and ash after burning its fleet and plundering its treasures. From there, they continued their advance towards Sidonia, which in turn collapsed before their brutality. They destroyed it and dragged its people through the streets. At every stop they overran, they intentionally left behind a trail of fire and destruction, seeking to shatter the prestige of Al-Andalus and instill terror in the hearts of its people. After this terrifying success, everyone expected the Vikings to continue their coastal advance along the same path to invade Cordoba, the most vital city and the seat of the emirate at the time. Since this large fleet was their ultimate strength and the ocean was their playground, it was certain they would keep sailing. But they vanished from the coastlines for a period, during which no one knew their whereabouts, until the peaceful residents of Seville were suddenly shocked by the giant Viking ships emerging from a small river in the heart of the city. Instead of staying in the open sea, they decided to penetrate the mouth of a river, the Guadalquivir River. Exploiting the brilliant design of their ships, which could navigate shallow waters, they carved their path inland like ghosts until they stood in the very heart of Seville. It was a city at the peak of its wealth and advancement, but it lay exposed without walls because it was far from the coast. No one had ever imagined an enemy capable of breaching it and reaching its heart via the river. This was what made their storming of Seville a shock that no Andalusian expected or was prepared to face. Despite all the tragedies that the Muslims of Al-Andalus had endured, the attack on Seville was the beginning of the true catastrophe. On the banks of Seville, the Viking hordes began to pour from the ships like rocks cascading from mountain peaks, with their long swords, gleaming axes, thick shields, and metal helmets. It was a sight that made the governor of Seville and his men feel that the confrontation was already decided in favor of these monsters. The governor attempted to gather volunteers, but they crumbled before the pagan war machine in mere minutes. The governor withdrew from the city toward Carmona to seek aid from the Emirates' army, leaving the Bride of Al-Andalus completely alone to face monsters thirsty for blood and gold. And from there, a hell began that lasted for 7 days and nights. The Vikings spread through the alleys like a plague, their swords harvesting necks with absolute coldness. They did not even respect the sanctity of the great mosque. They entered it with their horses and boots, slaughtering all the elders and the helpless who had sought refuge by the Qibla, believing the invaders would respect the holiness of the place. They plundered warehouses and homes, then set the city ablaze until black smoke blotted out the sun. The screams of women and children could be heard to the ends of the earth as they were led away by ropes, destined to be sold as slaves in the freezing lands of the north. 7 full days of this heartbreaking reality. The Vikings lived in absolute dominance, intoxicated by an illusion of victory because they had only fought civilians so far. 7 days of eating and drinking from the bounty of Seville over the corpses of its people, thinking that the grandson of the Hawk of Quraysh, the Emir of Al-Andalus, would quietly accept the shattering of his prestige. They did not know that every drop of blood was turning into a fire burning his heart and the hearts of the Umayyad commanders in Cordoba. He would settle for nothing less than a terrifying response that would wipe their arrogance off the face of the earth, leaving their heads hanging from the city's palm trees. After the days of destruction in Seville, following their crushing victory in Lisbon, the Vikings became convinced that the hardest part was behind them. They believed Al-Andalus had become an easy feast, just like the nations before it, and they began scanning the horizon for the next city to overrun. They did not know that this was merely the beginning, and that they had only awakened the wrath of a sleeping giant. Throughout this time, Emir Abd al-Rahman too was rallying the soldiers of Al-Andalus. He did not settle for his forces in the capital, Cordoba. He summoned his troops from every frontier, from Zaragoza and Toledo, and joined them with the Caliphate, the Emir's personal guard, the elite forces. He assembled a full standing army in record time under the command of the military genius Muhammad ibn Rustam, who engineered a plan that was not just an attack strategy, but a design for annihilation. A ruthless plan whose explicit goal was to crush the invaders down to the very last man. The Muslims studied the Vikings and understood that their primary weakness was patience and remaining organized over long periods. Their temper was a bit short. Their strength, of course, lay in their ships. As long as they remained near the river or the sea, they were safe, possessing a high capacity for maneuver and escape at any moment. If you went after them into the water, it was impossible to match or defeat them. Therefore, the strategy was built on a deceptive lure. We need to draw them away from the river, and then we will talk. Muhammad ibn Rustam began moving his forces to execute his plan. In the midst of this intense fury, it was expected that he would rush his army into Seville and attack the Vikings directly. This was exactly what the Vikings anticipated, so they braced themselves for the massive upcoming battle. But he did not do that. Instead, with absolute military coldness, he encamped his army in the city of Carmona and simply waited. But then, he made a sudden and baffling decision. He launched an attack on the Viking forces at their stronghold in the heart of Seville. The very thing everyone feared happened. The Viking forces overwhelmed the Muslims with a crushing display of power. The Muslims fled the city in rapid retreat, seemingly on the verge of defeat. Seeing this, the Vikings realized they could not afford to let this opportunity slip away. If they destroyed this army, they would control Al-Andalus entirely. So, they charged with all their might after the retreating Muslims. The Muslims fled at high speed with the Vikings hot on their heels, until they reached an area called Tablada, nestled amidst dense olive groves. Suddenly, the Muslim soldiers began to vanish, and the Vikings were shocked to find the earth split open, revealing thousands of cavalrymen surrounding them from every single direction. Massive numbers of Muslim soldiers appeared. 2 wings of infantry pinned them from the sides, while the heavy cavalry cut off their retreat from behind, blocking any path back to their ships. The Vikings realized too late that this was a trap. The Muslims had not lost, nor had they fled. This was Muhammad ibn Rustam's master plan to lure them into a pitched battle in open terrain, far from their ships and heavy gear. At that exact moment, Andalusian swords fell upon them from every direction with a terrifying fury. An overwhelming force that sent panic through the otherwise fearless Vikings. It was a fierce, relentless battle in which the Muslims harvested over 1,000 necks from the elite of the Viking warriors. Worse still for them, the commander of the fleet himself fell dead beneath. the hooves of the horses. His fall was a massive psychological blow, but it paled in comparison to the spiritual devastation that was about to follow. As the battle raged on and intensified, a large number of Vikings managed to finally retreat toward the riverbank to escape via their ships. But there, the ultimate horror awaited them. They found their massive fleet engulfed in flames, dozens of ships burning with a strange, ferocious fire they had never seen before. During the battle, specialized Muslim units had a single mission: to burn the ships. They bombarded them using catapults loaded with incendiary materials akin to Greek fire, a mixture of naphtha, sulfur, and other chemical compounds that created a liquid fire capable of burning normally on water. If anyone tried to extinguish it with water, it only blazed more intensely. This fire clung to the wooden hulls, igniting the ships and the warriors themselves until the very waters of the river seemed to be ablaze. It was an awesome, apocalyptic sight, despite their legendary bravery. The Vikings began to scream as they watched their ships melt away along with their warrior comrades. 30 ships were completely incinerated. More than a third of that majestic fleet turned to ash at the bottom of the river. It was a monumental victory for the Muslims, and a defeat of which the Vikings had never known. Despite all these losses, a large number of them managed to escape on the remaining ships, pulling away from the shores of Al-Andalus. They fled in a state of absolute shock from the sights they left behind. The bodies of their comrades hanging from the palm trees of Seville, severed necks lining its gates, and the head of their commander resting in the lap of Emir Abd al-Rahman. It was a clear, unmistakable message to any aggressor, no matter their strength. Al-Andalus has a shield and a sword, and any invader who enters it will only leave as a corpse scattered by the wind. But do you think the Vikings, with all their stubbornness and wrath, would accept this defeat? Or would a second hurricane from the north blow toward the Muslims? A new leader, with a larger army and an even grander fleet, returning to avenge their prestige, their pride, and the heads of their fallen brothers? After the victory, Al-Andalus lived for 15 years in a state of calm and cautious relief, confident that the pagan menace had been broken after Tablada. However, the leaders of Al-Andalus had learned harsh lessons. The most important was that this new enemy was far too strong and intelligent to ever be trusted, no matter how powerful you felt, and that monsters coming from the sea could only be stopped by a sea monster of equal ferocity. Therefore, this period of calm was not for rest. Quite the contrary, it hid behind it continuous work and ceaseless movement. It was the quiet before the construction of a beast. In those 15 years, Abd al-Rahman II transformed Al-Andalus into a massive shipyard. He built the naval arsenal in Seville, transitioning Al-Andalus from panic defense to the capacity for grim offense, forging naval fangs it had never possessed before. They also planted watchtowers along the coastlines from Cadiz to Denia, preparing themselves from every angle, as if tailoring a shroud for anyone who would dare approach their shores again. All this passed amidst peace and stability, until suddenly, in the year 244 of the Hijra, a massive pagan fleet appeared on the horizon. It carried a second wave of the world's fiercest warriors, fueled by rage and a thirst for vengeance, and under whose command? Bjorn Ironside, the son of Ragnar Lothbrok according to most accounts. The legend who had shattered the fortresses of Paris had arrived, accompanied by his cunning mentor and advisor, Hastian. Their goal was singular and explicit: to wash away the shame of the Vikings after what had been dealt to them 15 years prior. Bjorn arrived at the Bay of Cadiz, consumed by arrogance from his victories over European nations. He wanted to replicate the exact same tactic used in the previous invasion: enter the river to reach the heart of Seville directly. But he struck a reality he had never accounted for. The moment they appeared on the distant horizon, the early warning system and watchtowers sprang to life. Suddenly, Andalusian naval vessels emerged like sharks to confront them in the open sea, something no one else dared to do. He engaged them in battle, but in a short time, he lost a number of his ships to the Muslims' fire. He pivoted and entered from another direction, searching for a gap to breach the land directly and turn it into a land battle, only to find the ground forces standing waiting for him on the shore. Here, the son of Ragnar realized that Al-Andalus was fortified by land and by sea, and that playing around this time meant nothing but death or annihilation. Forced to change his plan, he abandoned the fortified shores of Al-Andalus and set his sights on the coasts of Africa, specifically Morocco, which was also ruled by the Islamic Caliphate, though its fortifications were far lesser than those of Al-Andalus. He entered the Mediterranean, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, and attacked the Moroccan city of Acre. They committed heinous, barbaric acts against peaceful civilians, even kidnapping women from the ruling family and taking the daughters of the emir himself. Then, fueled by malice and rage, he directed his force toward Algeciras. After a 3-day siege, they managed to breach and plunder it as well, burning down mosques in a provocative display against Muslims and the Umayyad state, a direct challenge to the heart of the Islamic Caliphate. Bjorn finished his raids, vented his rage, and wanted to flee. But he did not know that the Andalusian naval armada was merely waiting for a signal from the Umayyad leadership. Sure enough, the Umayyad fleet moved like a counter-hurricane. The new ships, which were larger and faster, cornered Bjorn at the narrowest point of the Strait of Gibraltar. There, a new epic began. The Muslims deployed naval catapults, giving him a taste of the Greek fire he had only heard about. For the second time, the Vikings lived through moments of pure hell, watching the sea turn into a sheet of fire and the wood of their ships ignite with a blaze that nothing could extinguish. Bjorn fled the battle with a handful of ships and retreated once more toward Morocco, specifically to the city of Wadi Nakhla in the Rif region. However, the shock there was even greater this time. They found the cavalry of the Idrisid state waiting for them on the shore. The Muslims in Morocco did not give them room to breathe. They cut off their supply lines and ground them down in fierce street fighting. For the second time in a single week, Bjorn fled with his fleet, dragging the tales of disappointment that he had grown accustomed to every time he faced the Muslims. The Vikings decided they would never face the Muslims again and would never set foot on their shores. It was over. But they desperately needed any victory to return home with, and any provisions they could plunder, gold or wealth, to offset their massive losses in the battles of Al-Andalus. They ventured deep into the Mediterranean, launching a campaign that lasted for 3 years, overrunning the coasts of Italy and Greece, plundering cities and lands. When they finished the campaign and decided to return to their homeland, they were forced to pass once more through the Strait of Gibraltar to enter the Atlantic Ocean. They expected it to be safe this time. 3 years had passed, meaning the Muslims had surely forgotten they were even at war. But they collided with the reality that the Andalusian fleet was lying in wait for them in the strait, like a lion waiting to pounce on its prey and finish it off. A pursuit ensued that is considered one of the fiercest naval battles in ancient history, two brilliant armadas warring against one another. The battle raged for a long time until the Muslims plucked the feathers of Bjorn, destroying the vast majority of his fleet. The Viking leader, who had entered with an army that shook the earth to avenge his pride, was left with only a fraction of his ships. He fled with 20 battered vessels, leaving behind in the depths of the sea the myth of the invincible Viking. He left his treasures, he left his men, and he returned to the lands of snow once more to tell them that the lands of the Muslims are a red line, and that he who enters them as flesh leaves them as ash. The battle ended, but the story is not over yet. It has a stunning final chapter that will make you rethink the true meaning of the power that the Muslims possessed. This was the end of the conflict between Muslims and Vikings in this generation. By the way, another major war occurred between them, but after more than a century, about 113 years later, when the Vikings tried to invade Al-Andalus with a massive fleet exceeding 100 ships. But to their misfortune, this was one of the strongest periods of Al-Andalus historically, marked by immense development, a massive economy, and powerful armies. The Andalusian fleet alone had grown to 300 ships. The important thing is that the Vikings who entered Al-Andalus did not all die, nor did they all flee. There were large numbers of them who remained as captives. Emir Abd al-Rahman II and the caliphs who succeeded him decided not to execute them. Instead, they allowed them to settle and live their lives there in regions like Cadiz and Seville. What happened next was a wondrous civilizational transformation. The pirates of the north, who had entered Al-Andalus as untamed beasts knowing nothing but harvesting necks and violating blood, integrated into Andalusian society in a beautifully peaceful and astonishing way. They embraced Islam, traded their battle axes for livestock, and became the most renowned cheese and dairy artisans in all of Spain, a living testament to a civilization that conquered not just lands, but hearts. They embraced Islam and became devout, righteous Muslims, living a simple and serene life. They transformed from plundering cities to building a brand new existence. They became renowned for their mastery in livestock breeding and the production of dairy and cheese. For long years, the markets of Seville took immense pride in offering the fine salted cheese crafted by the descendants of the Vikings. Imagine that the very hand which once held nothing but a cold metal axe soaked in blood was now serving fresh milk and soft cheese to their Muslim neighbors in Al-Andalus, proving to the world, once again, why the word Islam has always been, and will forever be, bound to the word peace. And here ends the story of the giant wooden dragons storming the lands of the Caliphate in Al-Andalus. It is a tale that began with terror, blood, and defeat, but culminated in glorious victories, Islamic dominance, and absolute sovereignty over the seas. It ended with titanic, savage enemies transforming into brothers, kin, and neighbors, because Al-Andalus did not just shatter their swords, it reached deep within, softening and uniting their hearts. Thank you for watching today's tale on Dodi Drama. I hope this story touched your hearts and enlightened your minds. Always remember to carry the lesson within your hearts. If you loved this world, join our growing family. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so we can continue this magical journey together.